So today I'd like to share some thoughts on the subject of surrender. And I think many children growing up become acquainted with war. We grow up and we hear about the wars of the past. And in America, it was the cowboys and the Indians a lot. They had a war. And in every war, at some point, assuming that everybody wasn't killed, somebody had to surrender. In the end, the stronger force was victorious, and they weren't, in the stories, they weren't always portrayed as the good guys. We like to say that the good guys always win in the end. But in any case, the stronger force forced the weaker force to surrender. And the words that we use don't always mean the same things to everybody. So I grew up with this. The meaning of surrender is you give up. You lay down your arms. But for the devotee, it's very different. When we give up, we give up. When the devotee gives in, you give in. It's a complete opposite of the worldly person's point of view. So when there's an interesting though in the most of the armed services and the police forces, they have a way of telling a person to stop the hostilities, but without the consciousness of negative surrender, of giving up. And they say, stand down. They say, stand down. That's a very respectful way of saying, be strong and stop the hostilities. We're not asking you to be weak. We're asking you to be stronger, to be strong enough to stop the hostilities. And this is really, in many ways, the call of the devotee. We're being asked to stand up and stop the hostilities towards ourselves and towards others. And this is really, we call it the battlefield of life. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Mahabharata, we have the story of Arjuna, who represents the devotee. And he's in his chariot. His chariot represents the body of the devotee, of a person, a human being. And the chariot is drawn by 5 horses. They represent the senses. And when you allow the senses to drive the chariot, chaos ensues. Unhappiness is the inevitable result. But when you become a devotee and you give yourself to God, you surrender yourself to God, then God comes in the form of the Guru and Krishna, and He drives the horses. He drives your body. He drives your life. And this is the key difference between the worldly man's surrender is to give up. Okay, you've beat me down. I'm nothing. And even that, see, the yogi says that, well, of course we're nothing. Life is a dream. But the worldly man thinks that his identification of ego and personality is nothing. Well, even that's true. It is nothing, but his wrong understanding is that his something has no value. His view of a little self has become small. When we turn our view towards ourselves with the devotee's point of view, we have a different view. We realize that the smaller the ego becomes, the the greater your consciousness becomes. You free your soul to experience greater and greater awareness of bliss. When we live in the ego, we live for emotional, sensual ups and downs. When we live in the soul, we live for expanding bliss, expanding peace, expanding understanding. We free ourselves from those little ups and downs. Swamiji told a story once about he was riding on a bus and he saw a creature, the shadow of a fly on the window, and because of the sun, for a moment it looked so big. But then he looked over and he saw, oh no, this is a little fly. Our challenges in this world look so big, but that's because of the way that we're looking at them. When you look at them with inner sight, with inner wisdom, you realize that they're not what they appear to be. The little fly was not the big monster that he initially thought it was. The key is to shift the way that we view life. But our challenge is that we're used to having that smaller view of our life experience. And of course, this is the great blessing of the spiritual life and of the yoga teachings, is that we're given the tools to clear our vision. Now, when we talk about surrender, we're not talking about becoming weak. We're talking about actually becoming all-powerful, because we're talking about identifying with infinite spirit instead of the limits of the human experience through the ego. So what we're trying to do is to enter into an ever-increasing potential. But as we live our daily lives, it's sometimes difficult to look at the challenge that's right in front of me and say, well, I don't see how having insufficient money this month in my bank account is going to make me a greater soul. I don't see how getting an illness is going to help me. I don't see how all of the ups and downs of life. Now, the ups are easier to say, well, going on vacation, certainly that's good. And we think that going on vacation is good karma. But if you think about your career in school, you have to say that it was the challenges that made you a better student. It was the challenges that made you successful in your scholastic career. It's our challenges in life that make us better devotees. Yoganandaji used to say, he said, what comes of itself, let it come. What comes of itself, let it come. And this attitude takes us out of the idea that we have to control everything, and we have to have everything in life the way we want it to be. The key is to shift our attitude towards those life experiences and recognize if illness comes, let it come. If a positive opportunity comes, let it come. Of course, we have a fabulous explanation for how these life experiences get to us through the law of karma. And we know that when Krishna drives the chariot of our lives, we know through history that the souls who have given over, have surrendered ego consciousness to disciple consciousness, which inevitably leads to God consciousness, that they experience that freedom, that bliss, that yearning that can never be filled in any other way. is fulfilled. By giving up the little self, we gain the larger self, the infinite self. So it would be a mistake for us to think that surrender is a word that means no responsibility for anything. We have to be responsible for turning towards God. Kriyanandaji said in the last few years of his life, because we had this, free will versus ego consciousness. I mean, how much free will do you really have? Because you're controlled by your past habits and your karma. And in the end, Swamiji said, you really don't have much to say about it, except the most important tipping point in life is to turn towards God or away from God. We make something that's quite simple very complicated. Well, what should I do here? 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 There's only one answer to all of those questions. Turn towards God. Well, how do I know that I'm turning towards God? Well, we have to grow in that knowing. And this is what happens in the spiritual life, is you grow in your ability to perceive what is God's will for this life. Because in the beginning, Arjuna didn't know where Krishna was going to drive the chariot to. He trusted Krishna, but he had doubts. And he told Krishna, I have doubts. And Krishna tried to dispel these doubts. But Arjuna kept having more and more doubts until finally he was so full of doubts, he realized himself that he could not solve his dilemma by expressing his doubts. He had to empty himself and say, stop doubting, stop talking, and start listening. And he said, Krishna, teach me. And it was from that point he surrendered. He surrendered his doubts. He surrendered his ego. He surrendered his, I'm going to figure this out. And in that surrender, Krishna revealed everything. And this is the key. Surrendering is not giving up. Surrendering is standing up, but with humility. Standing up with openness. Standing up with trust. Standing up with communion. Growing in that inner relationship so that we feel more and more in the most real way that God is present in our lives. And we've been given the tools to perceive God. So when we complain, I don't know what to do, I don't know, well, turn towards God. How do you turn towards God? All of the things that we do. We turn towards God when we pray, when we meditate. When we complain to God, we're turning towards God. When we commune with God, when we practice Kriya, when we spend time together with the Sangha, when we commit ourselves to service, when we share the blessings that we've been given. All of these ways, when we sing, as it said in that video, when we sing, when we express our choice, God. When we express, I have chosen God. And even if I make a mistake, if I've chosen God in that mistake, it'll be okay. We all are going to make mistakes. But make your mistakes with God. Bring God into your mistakes. Blame God for your mistakes. But turn towards God. And this is the way to surrender. So when you have a challenging situation in your life, that doesn't mean that you should let people walk on you. It doesn't mean you shouldn't stand up for that which is given you, the ways in which God challenges you to serve. Serve in those ways, but serve as a representative of God in the best way that you can. And through our association with God's presence in our lives, we will increase the chances that we will be living according to God's will. You know, God's will isn't just one thing. It's not just peas instead of corn. It's not, beige instead of green. God's will has a room for a wide variety of expressions. But all of those expressions are connected to the central truths of Dharma, of expansion of consciousness, of caring more about others rather than ourselves. Looking for the solution that's best for all, not just that we would prefer ourselves. When we have that, recognize that your greatest enemy in life is your own brother, your own sister. That every challenge in life is your best friend. Because when you have the intensity of a great challenge and you turn that energy towards God, great advancement can take place. And this is the key to understand that when we surrender, we're standing. We're standing recognizing that God is the door. And in that consciousness, we free ourselves from, we think that we need to figure it out. We think that I need to fix this. I need to do this. It's completely incorrect thinking. We need to think that God is going to do this through this form. When we recognize that God may want to make a mistake through you, sometimes your biggest mistakes will lead to your greatest blessings. You just don't know. That's why what comes of itself, let it come. If my best efforts have been given, then I have stood. I have done my best. And then if I'm blamed, fine. If I'm praised, fine. It's the same. Because who did you do it for? God. And who actually did it? God. And who received it? God. So if God in that form wants to yell at me, fine. We free ourselves from all of the reasons that have been making us unhappy, and we begin to grow in our awareness that God's bliss is always present. God's bliss is always available to us. And that the solution, there may be an outwardly practical solution to the challenge, but more importantly, the greatest solution is to feel God's presence in all circumstances. And when we do that, then we have surrendered our ego. We have surrendered our smaller view of what we would prefer as a personality and entered into God's view. That is God's will. God's will is that we live turned towards peace, turned towards bliss. And the details make very little difference. We make more of the details, and we get caught up in those details, and then we lose our connection with that peace, with the bliss. So, give yourself to God. Give up that separateness. Let God drive your life. Let God inspire you. And when we realize that God is always present, we will see more and more the blessing and the inspiration of each and every life experience. And it doesn't matter whether that outward experience looks like pleasure or pain. It's that connection underneath that will transcend those outward ups and downs. And this is the gift. The gift of discipleship is freedom from suffering, and the ever-increasing experience of God's bliss in every experience, always. So Don't think of surrendering as a diminishing. Recognize it for what it truly is from a devotee's point of view. It's freedom. Freedom from suffering and the awakening of the fulfillment of everything that we can possibly imagine becomes our own true self when we give ourselves to God 100%. Namaste.